This is the story of a woman who thought she understood the world until she died. Barbara, a 60-year-old woman from Tennessee, had lived a life of faith, tradition, and quiet assumptions. She never considered herself a bad person, but there were things she never questioned, things she never thought needed questioning. That all changed the day she slipped from life into death and stood before Jesus himself. What he showed her about black people, about history, and about the truth of humanity shattered everything she thought she knew. Now she's back, desperate to share what she learned before it's too late. Barbara grew up in a small Tennessee town where life was simple, predictable. She was raised in the church, sang in the choir, and knew every face at the local diner. Life wasn't always easy. Her father worked long hours in construction. Her mother stayed home raising 5 kids, and money was often tight. But there was comfort in familiarity. She was raised with strong values. Work hard, respect your elders, keep to your own. That last part wasn't something people said outright. It was just understood. People in her town mostly looked the same, went to the same churches, and stuck to their own communities. It wasn't that anyone was openly hateful. It was just the way things were. Barbara married young, had 3 children, and spent most of her life as a homemaker. She volunteered at church, helped with bake sales, and lived a life that by all accounts was good. She wasn't a cruel woman. She never used slurs, never mistreated anyone. But if she was honest, she had certain thoughts she never said out loud. She would lock her doors a little tighter when she saw young black men walking down her street. She felt uncomfortable in certain neighborhoods. She assumed things about people based on how they looked, how they spoke, but she never saw herself as racist. She loved God, and in her mind, that meant she loved everyone. Then came the day that would change everything. It was a quiet afternoon when Barbara felt the first twinge in her chest. She had just finished watering the plants on her front porch when a strange, tight pressure spread across her ribs. She brushed it off at first, probably just indigestion. But within minutes, the pain intensified, radiating down her left arm. She tried to call out for her husband, but her voice barely came out. The world around her blurred. The last thing she remembered was collapsing onto the porch steps, the cool wood against her cheek, her breath shallow and weak. Then, nothing. No sound, no sensation, just an overwhelming stillness. When Barbara opened her eyes, she wasn't in her yard anymore. She wasn't in her body. She was standing in a place she couldn't describe, bathed in a warm golden light. She felt no fear, no pain, just a strange sense of peace. But before she could even process what was happening, a voice called her name. And then she saw him. Jesus stood before her, not as a painting, not as the statue she had seen in church, but as something far greater. He was radiant, his presence filling everything around her. His eyes held a depth of love so overwhelming that Barbara felt like she might collapse under the weight of it. She wanted to speak, to ask where she was, but before she could, Jesus reached out and touched her hand. The moment he did, it was like every secret, every hidden thought, every unspoken judgment she had ever had was laid bare. Barbara flinched, ashamed. She had spent her entire life believing she was a good person, that she had lived righteously. But standing in front of him, she felt something else, realization. Jesus didn't say anything, but she knew. He knew. Every moment of quiet prejudice, every time she had looked at someone and assumed something about them, every time she had let fear shape her perspective, it was all there, exposed under his gaze. And then he spoke. "You have lived with love in your heart, but not for all," he said gently. "You have seen, but not truly understood." Barbara's knees buckled. She had no words, only the burning awareness that she had spent 60 years believing she saw the world clearly when, in reality, she had been blind. Jesus reached out his hand, and suddenly, the golden light around them shifted. Barbara was no longer standing before him. She was watching scenes from her own life unfold before her. She saw herself as a child, listening as adults around her spoke in hushed tones about people not like them. She saw herself locking her car doors at a red light when a black man crossed the street. She saw herself avoiding eye contact with the black cashier at the grocery store, assuming they weren't as educated, not even realizing she was doing it. Barbara wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She saw the way her unconscious biases had shaped her children, how little comments, little gestures had influenced the way they saw the world. She had never told them to treat anyone differently, but they had learned from her actions. Tears streamed down her face as Jesus showed her the truth, not to condemn her, but to help her see. "You never spoke words of hate," Jesus said, "but you allowed division to grow in your heart." Barbara sobbed. She had never thought of herself as part of the problem. But now, it was undeniable. Before she could even process the weight of her own past, Jesus turned and a new vision unfolded before her. She was no longer seeing her life, she was seeing history. Barbara watched as Africans were taken from their homes, shackled and forced onto ships. She saw the agony, the suffering. She saw enslaved people laboring under the sun, their backs scarred, their spirits unbroken. She saw the civil rights movement, protesters marching, standing firm against fire hoses and police dogs. She saw moments of unimaginable strength, of resilience beyond measure. She watched black soldiers fighting for a country that didn't always fight for them. She saw black mothers holding their children close, whispering prayers of hope despite the world's cruelty. And then she saw something else. She saw black joy. She saw churches filled with gospel music so powerful it shook the walls. She saw families gathering around tables, laughing, celebrating. She saw innovation, art, poetry, music, contributions so rich and deep that they had shaped the very soul of America. Barbara had never truly seen it before. She had never understood. Tears streamed down her face as Jesus spoke again. "You have feared what you did not understand, but now you will see." Barbara stood frozen, overwhelmed by everything she had just witnessed. The weight of history, the sorrow, the resilience, it was too much to process at once. She had never considered herself racist. She had always believed she treated everyone fairly, that she judged people by their character, not their skin. But now, standing before Jesus, she saw the truth. Her own ignorance had been its own kind of injustice. Jesus turned to her, his expression neither angry nor condemning. Instead, there was only love in his eyes. "You were not born with these fears," he said. "They were planted. But now, you have the chance to uproot them." Barbara felt herself trembling. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she whispered. Jesus nodded. "And yet, the absence of cruelty does not mean the presence of love." He then extended his hand again, and another vision appeared before her. This time, it was of people, different races, different cultures, embracing each other, working together, lifting one another up. She saw white and black children playing together, their laughter pure and free of judgment. She saw communities where people focused on each other's hearts instead of their skin. "This is what I created," Jesus said. "Not division, not fear, not separation. Love." Barbara sobbed. It seemed so simple, so obvious now. Why had she never seen it before? Before Barbara could fully absorb everything, the vision shifted again. She was now standing in the middle of a celebration, one unlike anything she had ever experienced. The air was alive with the sound of drums, laughter, and voices lifted in song. The colors were rich and vibrant, and the energy was electric. She watched as people danced in rhythm to music that felt ancient yet modern, deep yet joyful. She saw families gather together, passing down traditions from one generation to the next. She felt the power of storytelling, of shared history, of a culture deeply rooted in faith, community, and love. Barbara had never taken the time to truly appreciate it before. She had never asked about it, never sought to understand. But here, in this place, she was seeing it for the first time, not as an outsider, but as someone finally willing to listen. "These are my people," Jesus said. "They always have been." Barbara's heart swelled. She had lived so many years believing in a version of America that didn't fully recognize the beauty of its people. She had never realized how much she had been missing. Jesus then led her to another scene, one that was quieter, yet just as powerful. She saw two people, one white, one black, sitting across from each other. There was pain in their eyes, years of misunderstanding, but as they spoke, something shifted. Barbara watched as forgiveness unfolded, not just in words, but in action. She saw people acknowledging their past mistakes, choosing to learn instead of defend. She saw hands extended, barriers broken, communities coming together. "This is how healing begins," Jesus said, "not in avoiding the past, but in facing it together." Barbara thought of all the times she had ignored conversations about race, all the times she had dismissed issues that didn't directly affect her. She had believed that ignoring something meant it wasn't her problem. But now, she understood. Change wasn't about avoiding discomfort. It was about stepping into it with an open heart. She turned to Jesus, tears streaming down her face. "What do I do now?" she asked. Jesus smiled. "You learn, you listen, and you love." Jesus then showed her the present, the world as it was, right now. She saw the pain, the division, the misunderstandings that still ran deep in society. But she also saw hope. She saw people trying, even when it was hard. She saw friendships forming across racial lines, people standing up for one another, communities working toward a better future. "The world is not lost," Jesus said. "It is still growing." Barbara saw young people leading conversations that previous generations had avoided. She saw schools teaching history honestly, without shame but with understanding. She saw churches embracing all people, not just those who looked the same. There were still struggles, still resistance, still fear, but there was also change. And that was enough to keep moving forward. Then, Jesus showed Barbara a future, one that could be. It was an America where people worked together, where differences were celebrated instead of feared. She saw communities thriving, neighbors helping each other, people of all races lifting each other up. She saw schools where children learned about each other's histories with respect, where no one was left out of the story. She saw workplaces filled with diversity, where opportunity was given based on talent, not skin color. She saw churches overflowing with love, welcoming all who entered. "This is what is possible," Jesus said. "But it is a choice." Barbara felt a sense of urgency. She wanted to hold on to this vision, to carry it back with her, to share it with everyone she could. Jesus turned to her, his eyes filled with a love so deep it made her soul ache. "It is not too late," he said, "but it begins with you." And just like that, the light around her faded. Barbara gasped as she woke up in her hospital bed, her chest rising and falling in short, shaky breaths. She was back. She was alive. And she knew what she had to do. Barbara lay in her hospital bed, still feeling the echoes of what she had seen. But even as she tried to hold on to the warmth of the vision, a deep sense of urgency gripped her. Jesus had shown her a future filled with love and unity, but he had also made one thing clear: this was only possible if people made the right choices. She remembered how the vision had changed, how the light had dimmed as Jesus showed her what would happen if people refused to embrace each other. She had seen communities tearing apart, families divided over fear and anger. People were shouting past one another, refusing to listen. She saw how misinformation spread like wildfire, turning neighbor against neighbor. Worst of all, she saw people who claimed to follow Jesus, yet their hearts were hardened. They used his name to justify their own prejudice, twisting faith into something unrecognizable. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The greatest threat, Jesus had said, is not hatred. It is indifference. It is the choice to do nothing. Barbara understood. She had spent decades believing she was not part of the problem simply because she wasn't openly hateful. But now she saw that silence, in the face of injustice, was its own form of harm. She had ignored, dismissed, and overlooked. She vowed, right then and there, that she would not be silent any longer. Barbara's heart ached as she recalled another part of the vision. Jesus speaking directly to black people. She had seen them through his eyes, not as a group burdened by struggle, but as warriors of faith, strength, and endurance. "My beloved," Jesus had said, his voice full of deep sorrow yet unwavering love, "you have carried burdens that were never meant for you. You have endured more than you should have, yet you have not broken." Barbara saw flashes of history, the pain of slavery, the injustices of segregation, the battles still being fought today. But then she saw something else. She saw churches filled with praise, families standing together, communities rising up in love despite everything they have faced. She saw brilliant minds shaping the world, artists creating beauty, leaders inspiring change. "You are not forgotten," Jesus continued. "Your resilience is a light. Your love, your faith, your joy. It is powerful beyond measure." Tears had streamed down Barbara's face as she listened. She had never fully understood the depth of what black people had endured, nor had she truly appreciated their strength. But now she saw them for who they truly were, children of God, deeply loved, deeply valued. Barbara then remembered another moment, one she hadn't expected. Jesus turned, his gaze settling on her with quiet intensity. "My white children," he said, "I have never asked you to carry guilt, but I have asked you to open your hearts." Barbara saw generations of people like her, good, hardworking, faithful, who had never considered themselves part of the problem, yet had done little to be part of the solution. She saw how fear had kept them from stepping forward, how misunderstanding had built walls between them and their black brothers and sisters. "Fear is not from me," Jesus said gently. "Love is." He did not ask for shame, nor for self-hatred. He asked for honesty, for listening, for standing alongside instead of apart. Barbara felt something shift inside her. She had spent her life thinking that ignoring race was the right thing, that being colorblind meant she was doing good. But now she understood. Seeing people truly, in all their depth, was the only way to love them fully. Jesus then took Barbara to a place she knew well, a church. But something about it felt different. She watched as people entered the sanctuary, some with open hearts, others with skepticism. A black man and a white man sat on opposite sides of the pews, both hesitant. But then something happened. The pastor, standing at the pulpit, began to speak about love, not just in words, but in action. "We cannot call ourselves followers of Christ," he said, "and ignore the suffering of our brothers and sisters." Barbara watched as people who had once been divided by discomfort began to truly see each other. They shook hands. They'd prayed together. They'd broke bread at the same table. "This is my church," Jesus had said. Not a building, but a people. Barbara realized how much the church, her church, had stayed silent on issues of race, how it had avoided uncomfortable truths. She had heard people say, "We don't talk about those things here." But Jesus made it clear, his church was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be transformative. As the vision faded, Jesus turned to Barbara one last time. "Change does not begin in governments or in policies," he said. "It begins in hearts." Barbara understood. She had spent much of her life waiting for someone else to fix things. Politicians, pastors, activists. But now, she saw that change was not a distant, complicated thing. It was a daily choice, made by ordinary people. She saw visions of simple acts, listening to a neighbor's story, standing up when someone was wronged, teaching children to see love instead of fear. Barbara knew, with absolute certainty, that she had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to live differently. And just like that, she woke up. Barbara gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. Her husband was at her bedside, gripping her hand with wide, worried eyes. "You're back," he whispered. She looked at him, tears spilling down her cheeks, and said the only thing that mattered. "I have something to tell you." Barbara sat up in her hospital bed, her body weak, but her mind racing. She had just been in the presence of Jesus, had seen the truth, had understood the depth of everything she had missed in her 60 years on earth. But there was something else, something she couldn't shake. In the final moments before she had returned to her body, Jesus had shown her what would happen if people did nothing. If they saw injustice but ignored it. If they allowed fear to dictate their choices. If they assumed it was someone else's responsibility to make things better. She had seen churches growing cold, their messages empty because they avoided hard truths. She had seen communities where people stayed in their own circles, too afraid or unwilling to reach across the divide. She had seen politicians using division as a tool, stirring fear instead of unity. Worst of all, she had seen what happened to hearts that refused to change. People who clung to their old ways, who justified their silence, who hardened themselves to love. The world does not need more silence, Jesus had told her. It needs courage. Barbara felt that truth in her bones. She had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to live boldly, to speak when it was uncomfortable, to love when it was difficult. And she knew that if people didn't wake up, if they didn't take action, the future could be far darker than she had ever imagined. Oh, Barbara's thoughts drifted to something else Jesus had shown her. The power of learning, of truly understanding one another. She had seen classrooms where history was taught honestly, not just the easy parts, but the whole truth. She had seen children reading books about people who looked different from them, learning about their struggles, their triumphs, their humanity. She had seen young people leading conversations that older generations had avoided, asking hard questions, pushing for real change. And then she had seen what happened when people refused to learn. She saw how ignorance bred fear, how fear led to resentment, and how resentment turned into division. She saw how easy it was for lies to spread when people never took the time to listen to one another. Barbara understood, now more than ever, that change couldn't happen without education. People had to be willing to learn, to ask questions, to open their hearts to perspectives they had never considered before. The truth will set you free, Jesus had said, but first, you must be willing to hear it. Barbara blinked at the fluorescent lights above her, realizing that she was fully back in her body. The weight of what she had seen still pressed against her chest, but there was something else, urgency. She turned to her husband, who was gripping her hand as if afraid she might slip away again. "What happened?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Barbara swallowed. How could she even begin to explain? How could she put into words everything she had just experienced? I died, she said, still struggling to believe it herself. And I saw him. Her husband's eyes widened. Jesus. Barbara nodded, tears forming in her eyes. And he showed me things I never saw before. She took a deep breath. I have to change. Her husband stared at her, confusion flickering across his face. Change what? Everything. Barbara didn't waste any time. Once she was strong enough to leave the hospital, she started sharing her story. First with her family, then with friends, then with anyone who would listen. At first, people were skeptical. Some dismissed her experience as a dream, a hallucination. Others were uncomfortable, not wanting to talk about race, about division, about things that felt too heavy. But Barbara didn't let that stop her. She spoke at church gatherings, telling fellow believers that Jesus had called them to love fully, not just when it was easy. She spoke at community meetings, urging people to listen to one another, to ask questions instead of making assumptions. She joined book clubs, read about history she had once ignored, formed friendships with people she had once unknowingly kept at a distance. Slowly, people began to listen. A neighbor who had always felt unwelcome at the local church showed up for service one Sunday, moved by Barbara's words. A friend who had never considered herself part of the problem started having deep conversations with her children about race. Barbara wasn't changing the world overnight, but she was changing hearts, one at a time. Barbara knows that not everyone will believe her story. She knows that some will dismiss it, some will push it aside, some will continue living as they always have. But she also knows this: she was sent back for a reason. I don't think Jesus needed me to change the whole world, she says. I think he needed me to change myself. And if my story can help even one other person open their heart, then that's enough. Barbara's message is simple but powerful. Love louder than fear. Listen more than you speak. Be willing to change, even when it's uncomfortable. And never, ever assume that you see the whole picture, because only God does. She looks into the camera, her eyes filled with certainty. Jesus showed me the truth, and now I leave it with you.